please help me in welcoming our esteemed panel who's ready to take on addressing addressability with us. With us is Abby Sen, co-founder and CEO at Number 8 Technologies, Brad Jeffrey, Managing Director, Canada at Index Exchange, along with our moderator, Brian Siegel, Senior Vice President of Sales at Comscore. Brian, I'm going to hand things over to you.
Addressing addressability, how fun can it get at the end of the day? And this used to be the time slot before you go get drinks at the annual general meeting. So hopefully we can coast you right into the AGM and have a really sort of fun conversation today about addressability. We have two great speakers today on hand with Brad and Abby, and I'm going to just pass it off and start with Abby. Just give us a little bit of information about who you are, your company, and just overall what your main objective on the panel is today. What are you going to focus on?
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Brian. And thanks everyone to IAB Canada for organizing this topic around addressing addressability. My name's Abby Sen, co-founder and CEO of Number 8. My background primarily has been in software engineering, actually. I graduated from Waterloo in 2009. I'm based in London right now, but I'm from Canada. Did my bachelor's in computer engineering from Waterloo, and then worked primarily at handset manufacturers. So that being the Blackberries, the Palm, and the Apples. So my background is very much from the device manufacturer side of things. And eventually started Number 8, and Number 8 came out of the ability to see, all I wanted to start was basically say, what is my device doing at a given point in time to recommend the right kind of music? So, well, that was a long time ago, but today what we do at Number 8 is to take that exact same intelligence and say, what is my device doing at a given point in time, then recommend content for me. At Number 8, we're looking at context prediction, and that's what we do. Everything that I say today in this panel's forum is basically from the lens of a mobile in-app perspective, because that's where we operate. So at what we do at Number 8 is being able to, so we are a mobile contextual data provider. And hopefully we'll dig into that a little bit more as we talk about addressability and what are some of the challenges that the industry is facing right now with the privacy concerns and so on. So thanks again, Brian.
Okay, and Brad, give us an elevator pitch on you.
Thanks, Brian. So Brad Jeffrey, I'm Managing Director here at Index Exchange for Canada. Index Exchange, we're a global programmatic advertising marketplace. And I'll be looking at, or I'll be contributing to this conversation from sort of the role of the technology in the middle, so that of the exchange, or also commonly referred to as the SSP. We've been working for many years on some solutions to support a post cookie world, and so I'll certainly want to kind of touch on that a little bit today, and sort of how we sort of foresee or what the addressable market looks like in a post-cookie world, as well as some of the other solutions that are out there, which I think will complement one another quite well over the next few years as we move forward here. As Abby mentioned as well, I think we'll probably touch on consumers and privacy and all that good stuff as well over the course of our chat here.
Well, I think my job is to decide what we're going to talk about. So let's get down to business right now. And, I think on our pre-call, the thing we spent a lot of, probably most of the time so we use this term a lot, but I guess what is addressability? Like, what does it mean to you, and how do you use it in your business today? So let's start with Brad.
Yeah, I think in its most simplistic form, like to me, addressability is the ability to show targeted and relevant messages when buying media. That's really what it boils down to. And I think how that ultimately manifests or what that looks like can be represented in a number of different ways, whether that is through the use of cookies, whether that's through the use of identity-based graphs or contextual. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that can ultimately be represented. But if I was really to distill it down to one thing, it's showing targeted and relevant messages to the consumer.
Right. And Abby, what does addressability mean to you?
Absolutely. I'll just build on, and then Brad put it very well. We used this analogy a while back, as soon as The Apple announcement came through last year with the IDFA application. It's like addressability almost the same of, we used to get menu cards, at restaurants used to have menu cards. In restaurants, you have a restaurant name, the Chinese takeout and Indian takeout and so on. Now imagine that billboard in front of the restaurant is no longer there. You don't know what kind of restaurant it is. The same thing will happen in the event of IDs going away. So it's almost like saying, how do I know as an advertiser that I want to reach a relevant audience? And that's that addressability piece. I want to convey my message, my product, service to a relevant audience. And that is the ability to address or reach relevant people. So that's what I would say is addressability from our point of view. And I think that makes sense it just builds on what Brad is saying, really. So yeah.
So following that up, what's the current state of addressability, web versus an app? So just kind of walk us through, like, what's the current state?
Again, with the in-app lens, addressability has taken a very interesting twist, because even though, what we've seen, again, at least on the iOS front, and Android, of course, will have its own privacy changes coming up with Android 12 coming up later this year or earlier next year. You've had, IDFA or identifier for advertiser used to be the way advertisers would be able to deliver more relevant and personalized messaging for consumers. With that opt-in for ATT opt-in being in the hands of consumers, as if you're an iPhone, as you must have seen the pop-up coming up, do you allow or not allow access to your identity being used? We've seen across the board, across different genres of apps or different types of apps have had different adoption rates, but between 20 to 30% is what you can say as a ballpark number. That means 75% of the inventory of all ad requests going out are currently ID-less, that do not have any ID field populated. And that will be a challenge going forward, I would imagine, because all of a sudden you don't have the ability to address, as we talked about, or reach a relevant audience. And that's what we're seeing in this space going forward, where privacy first approaches, contextual approaches, first party data, as I think the previous talk Lee was talking about as well, they will become more and more important going forward. And instead of looking at it as like, oh shoot, what do we do? There's a massive opportunity to be had away, because you're almost redefining what targeting is going to look like for the next decade almost.
That's all we're doing? Just for the next decade?
Much. Yeah, we just have 35 minutes to actually come up with the plans. That's perfect.
Brad, how about you?
Yeah, no, I would agree with a lot of what Abby had said, and as far as the IDFA rates and consent numbers around that for mobile app, like we're seeing numbers in a similar ballpark as well. I mean, I think to bring it back to your original question, what is the current state? I think the reality is there's still a lot of questions, there's challenges and problems that and regulations that ultimately need to be solved for. But I don't really view it as sort of a doom and gloom type scenario. I think really it's there are already options that are being worked on in market, whether again it is cohort type audiences, whether it's identity, whether it's contextual, and I think the reality is we're at the early stages of kind of seeing potentially two different types of open web starting to form. You've got sort of your authenticated type version of a web, which is obviously fueled and supported by consumer consent and things of that nature, and then you've got your anonymous web starting to form as well. So I think, to again bring it back to your question, it's early days, but I think there's a lot of reason still for there to be optimism, and we don't necessarily need to be overly concerned. There's a lot of very smart individuals that work in this space, and I think collectively, we'll find a path forward that works for the collective.
So both your businesses have let's call it a global aspect to it, and have seen sort of some learnings either from the EU or the US. And can you just share with our crowd today up here in Canada a little bit about some of the maybe one or two learnings that we've seen in the US or EU that can be applied in Canada today, or things that we should be on the eye for? So let's start with you, Brad.
Sure. Yeah, I think I think one of them that admittedly surprised me off the top was, we've now lived through GDPR in Europe, and the good news is, we've been able to solve for that. We've been able to navigate that and learn. And one of the key things that's been interesting to learn is, what the consent rates have looked like in Europe, and typically, across the platform, we're seeing consent rates in France, which is typically the most strictest in terms of their interpretation of GDPR, north of 70%. For the rest of Europe, I believe we're looking north of 80. So I think that's one thing that we should, really be encouraged by, and Europe has done a very good job of educating the consumer as far as why media companies or publishers, are requesting that type of permission for, and I think that's something that we'll certainly need to do more of in North America as we continue to find our way, moving towards some form of changes in regulation. But I think that the one thing that we can hang our hat on is we've lived through GDPR, and I think that's really encouraging for whatever the next steps might look like here in Canada.
Abby, how about you? You have an opinion on this?
Yeah. So as we're a MobX company, MobX being mobile context. So quite a few learnings in the last 6 to 9 months in terms of, because we engage as a data provider, as an on-device data provider, we're engaging with media agencies, to SSPs, to publishers, to like a whole range of players in the ecosystem. And a few things that have come up is, at least in our conversations, let's say, starting with media agencies, there's a much stronger data partner onboarding process, because all of a sudden you're being asked to say, all right, where are you sourcing your data? How are you getting access to all of this? And so there's a definite push towards understanding and building out a much more trusted marketplace of reliable data partners who take privacy into account. And almost privacy is no longer as like a checkbox, it's becoming more and more important from an agency side of things. That's what our conversations have been. That's one learning. Secondly, we've learned, interesting enough, the word contextual, right? It means so many different things. And we've engaged with different IABs as well. We're here in UK and others, so, almost as, contextual in a web environment, contextual in an in-app environment, and they're very different, of course, because the consumer experience is different, the device and the format and the platforms are very different. So navigating through that is quite tricky. And of course, we are a startup and we're actually having to engage with players, because contextual, if you think about it from the web space, it is related to content. But in a mobile in-app environment, contextual means very different things. And there's almost an education process that goes through in that, in terms of making sure that agencies and brands and advertisers really understand, okay, what does contextual really mean in an in-app environment? And how can we tap into that as privacy first approaches become more and more important? Those are the two that come to mind immediately, I would say.
So we're coming to the end of 2021, and I hate these crystal ball questions, but I guess what's on the horizon? What do we got to keep our eye out for over the next 3 to 6 to 12 months or over 2022 that really is something that we gotta keep in mind for as it pertains to addressability over the next 3 to 6 to 12 months? So Abby, why don't we start with you?
Sure. There were reports. We probably saw Facebook reporting, should be some Meta reporting.
Thank you.
Yeah. Meta reporting that, they had a revenue loss from the result of IDFA, Snapchat reporting similar losses, while Twitter not so much, because, again, it comes down to the same equation. And you have 20% of the mobile ad traffic having IDs and 80% not having identifiers. At some point in time, the floor is going to fall off, we think. And it hasn't happened yet for a number of reasons, but we will see, and you'll see a lot of investment from publishers and SSPs also in consolidation of supply will happen, and we're seeing that already because of the significant M&A activity that's going on. And you'll also see a continued interest in first-party strategies from publishers themselves, and figuring out ways to basically use this, this time where where identity has been, is under question. We'll see new ways of approaching and reaching relevant people, relevant users, and that will open up a whole new wave of innovation. That's what I would say.
All right, Brad, anything, is the floor falling off, or what do you see in the next 3, 6, 12 months type of time frame?
Yeah, no, I agree a lot with a lot of what Abby had said, and I think innovation will continue to be at the forefront. I think the other things just to be aware of or keep in mind or acknowledge is the consumer's place in our world is continuing to rise as well, right? If we think back over the last 15 years, we've seen consumers grow increasingly, mistrustful of, some of the role of third party and things of that nature. And so I think we should all, be mindful of that and acknowledge that, and prepare for the fact that, there's going to be enhanced transparency moving forward that's going to put more control into the hands of consumers, right? And that's a good thing. And so the other thing I would say is, and this, we're starting to see signs of this already in Canada, and it'll continue, but keep testing and starting to prepare yourself for what the this inevitable new world ultimately looks like. I'm speaking from more of a platform perspective, where I say this, where there is change coming, and let's not, we were given, a little bit extra time as far as, Chrome deprecating third-party cookies and things of that nature. But let's not be, let's not put that off or take advantage of that time too much. And procrastinate. Let's continue to move forward and try and leverage and use that time as efficiently as we can. And I think, again, we're seeing some really encouraging signs of that. There was a recent release in Canada a couple of weeks ago around Universal ID 2 and some parties looking to start testing there and things of that nature. And I think that we'll be hearing a lot more of that over the coming 3, 6, 12 months down the road and so forth.
A couple of things that add, Brian, just one thing just came to mind. One is just on the mobile in-app front, right? They've seen user acquisition costs go up significantly on the social front, significantly. And that's because, that is exactly because of the iOS changes. Okay, so this is on iOS we're talking about. It has significantly gone up, and agencies have reported, app companies have reported that, because all of a sudden I used to pay $1 to acquire a new user, all of a sudden that's $3. What's going on? That's directly related to the iOS changes that Apple introduced last year. So that's one immediate impact that's happening on budgets. And that's why you've seen people shifting budgets to Android all of a sudden, but that's again a short-term measure. You'll start seeing budgets moving back to iOS again, because consumers on iOS aren't really going anywhere else. That's one impact immediately. And on the front of, in terms of the privacy first changes, we are seeing a lot of appetite for cohort-based approaches in terms of, and the trust for, almost trying to understand where is the data coming from. We're getting a lot of, because we are a data partner. So there's a lot more scrutiny in terms of where is the data being sourced from agencies, even from SSPs and from publishers. And that's something that is coming up constantly. And it's something to keep in mind, to ask questions of your partners, how is this data source? How relevant is it? How valid is it? So yeah, that's just two things that just came to mind.
Great. Well, it touches on a subject that's near and dear to my heart, especially the role I play in the IAB. Is we're in the business of being in business, and so how do you think addressability is going to affect the buy side and sell side, and what are some of the outcomes? And is this a boom or bust? Is this gonna enrich our opportunities, or is it going to kill a whole bunch of agencies and publishers? What's going to be the outcome of all of this? So Let's start with you, Brad.
Um, I would say boom. I would not say bust. That might not come as a surprise to you. Also in the business of business. I think kind of bringing it back to one of the comments I was making earlier. I mean, I think that just fundamentally the way we view the open web today is going to be different. There are going to be whether you want to call them cohorts or whether there's going to be groupings of consumers out there that are going to just be more valuable through the eyes of the marketer, because there's a lot more information that's potentially available to be used to inform the transaction than there has been before. Conversely, there's also going to be sort of an anonymized version of the web out there also, where some of that information that would have typically been leveraged in a third-party cookie scenario, or kind of looking ahead into it, there isn't sort of that one-to-one or identity-based user graph that's being leveraged, or there isn't an IDFA that's being passed, some sort of persistent identifier. Those users may become or just seen or valued differently. And let's not forget, like there's going to be a number of different solutions that are going to be out there as well. There's not just going to be one. And so I think for both publishers and buyers, it's going to be prudent to, again, test many different types of solutions and ultimately find, what composition of those is best for your own business, because what's best for you isn't necessarily going to be what's best for your neighbor.
Okay, and let's talk to your Abby. Let's talk to your neighbor.
In terms of boom or bust, there was a FAQ we put out a couple of years, actually maybe last year on, how audiences are built traditionally. But if you have DMPs building audiences, how is it actually built? And it was very interesting because we had a lot of uptake on that FAQ. Said, all right, traditionally you have a cookie ID, or you have an ID from mobile in-app environments that has, Brian, let's say you have an ID, and then it's not Brian, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you have a whole lot of attributes that get added on to some kind of centralized repository. That's traditionally what a DMP has been doing. Now, and then you can have, of course, map your laptop to your device, to any of the, any other workstations you might be using, to map into one cross-device, identity. In the in-app environment, that DMP concept just falls right through, because there is no ID column. That column just disappears for 80% of the inventory. So the only way to address, if we come back to the first question that you asked, what does addressability mean? The advertiser demand to reach relevant people is not diminishing. That's still there. People are spending more and more time. I mean, think of it, people are spending 4 to 5 hours every day on their mobile phones, and that too in an in-app environment. That's not changing. So there's still appetite. So how do you then address these people? How do you reach your relevant audiences? So we'll see, I would say that fundamental notion of requiring an identity before being able to surface something relevant, that will be rethought in the coming months. And that's, I see as a massive opportunity for the industry, be it in the web or in the in-app environment, both. How do you address going forward? And there's a lot of solutions that Brad mentioned, got a lot of them out there. And so, yeah, I'd say that, but that fundamental thing that mobile advertising or even web advertising has always relied on, that concept of an identifier, will be rethought.
So, you guys talked a little bit here, and on the publisher side, I heard about new tools. I've heard about doing tests. I've heard about investments. How does the value exchange need to change in order to account for all these investments and all of these increased user acquisitions, increase for all of these different, let's call it factors that come into play with addressability? Like, what needs to happen in order for there to be a valuable supply chain where both the buy side and sell side are both delivering what they need to in order to be successful on the advertiser front? So, Abby, you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I mean, first is, one thing that we're doing on our front, going back to an earlier conversation, Ron, contextual targeting and the confusion in the ecosystem around contextual targeting, at least in an in-app environment. What is it? There's a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that both sides are speaking the same language. And by that I mean taxonomy, making it easier for the buy side to be able to buy into, even if it's contextual targeting, to be able to buy into contextual based inventory. That's a very important piece of work. I know we're working through IAB Tech Lab and other sources through Prebid, for example, working through these consortium bodies to ensure that both parties can actually transact at a level that makes it easy for them to buy ID-less inventory. If in the event, you have actually most of the, like a majority of the inventory is actually ID-less. That's a very important, because without that, you're stuck at two parties talking different languages and not understanding the value that you're able to extract. That's important. From a consumer point of view, there's of course got to be, that transparency, or this is the data, and you see a whole rise in CMPs coming up. So CMPs, you have a lot of publishers building their own CMPs, some SSPs building their own CMPs as well. So consent will become an even more important topic to talk about going forward. So, but the taxonomy piece is very important, because without the taxonomy, you will be able to transact at scale, which is what's important to get the volume that you're looking for.
All right, Brad, what needs to go on in order for the value exchange to account for addressability?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, kind of bringing it back to looking at other markets and what they've potentially done well and what we can glean from that. If we look at Europe, and I'm speaking right now kind of directly just from a publisher to consumer perspective, but I think really, and Abby kind of touched on this, but I think it really comes down to education and what is that value proposition there. So as a publisher, I'm requesting this information. Why am I requesting that information? And we've seen publishers in the EU do a really good job of that. As far as educating their consumers as to why that is. And once they've been able to do that, that then starts to create, as Abby had touched on, that's when you then start to see scale and things of that nature. Scale is going to be, tremendously important. And there is going to be need to be some level of agreement on, how many of these different languages we're going to speak. It'll probably start where there's there's more, and it'll be it'll start to consolidate over time. But if we look at what it is now, and I'm speaking from from a user matching perspective, there could be 200 different types of matches going on out there across the programmatic ecosystem. That certainly needs to be, I think, tightened up and consolidated. But I think it really starts there, from that educational piece and putting the consumer first, because none of this happens without that first piece. It's really the first domino that needs to fall before anything else.
So with all that's very nice, but what's going to happen to CPMs? Are we going to see tiered rate cards? Are we going to start to see CPMs based on first party data? Are we going to see CPMs based on addressability, based off of do we need to change the kind of basis for value equation to adapt to this, and to adapt to the investment that the publisher side needs to make in order to make this work?
Mm-hmm.
So Brad, we'll start with you.
Well, I won't pretend to start putting together a rate card or anything to that effect, but I'll just point to a few sort of basic economic principles, and I was just able to squeak through my Laurier economics class, but part of this is going to be a supply and demand thing, right? And if we're dealing with 100% of the pie now, let's just say, whatever that opt-in rate is, or whatever that match rate ultimately becomes, it's going to be less than 100%, but the reality is, if there's less supply in the market, the demand for that, or the pricing for that, is probably going to go up. If you look at something like video as an example, like obviously it's a phenomenal method of getting your message across, and there's a premium for that, but part of that also is just due to the fact that there's less premium video opportunities to advertise than say there would be in say display. So I think that's part of it, and which will drive some of the pricing up for those particular audiences. And I also think that CPMs will be driven up too, just by not only just the supply demand piece, but also what information is available. Now we're talking about potentially one-to-one, type addressability, which again, I'm on a bit of a sell side bias, but can't help but think that that's going to increase the value of what an impression ultimately looks like. Conversely, there's going to be a bunch of anonymous type inventory out there too, and so that could potentially see CPMs maybe go the other way. So again, to bring it back to your boom or bust question, I think overall, especially for the top media sellers out there, they'll probably see CPMs rise as a result of some of these new ways of targeting coming out over the next few years.
Abby, do you agree with Brad?
I'm just going to fill in. I do agree with the supply demand thing, but that just makes a lot of sense. And we actually seen that as well. With the user acquisition thing, that's exactly what happened. And why have agencies and advertisers seen their user acquisition costs go up? Because the supply went down, so the demand for the ID traffic or the consented traffic, when people said, okay, increase, so then that price increased 2x, 3x. So that makes complete sense. From the point of being able to reach, if CPMs overall are going to go up or down, that really depends on the format that you're trying to reach at. Really depends. We're seeing, for example, in in-game environments, so in-game opportunities for advertisers opening up, audio is opening up as a new game, mobile app and brands are getting interested. So there's so much value that you can get as an advertiser to go into again with an in-app environment. So much value to be had to go in at, because you'll have quality inventory coming through with the renewed push towards first party data. That means reliable data. It's not relied on some panels coming out, etc. It's really based on the publisher's own first. So that means that's quality data. Then you can have premium targeting, because where, and it's a brand safe environment as well. So I would expect in certain cases CPMs to go up. And that's even taking aside the point of the supply demand economics over there, just because the nature of the inventory and the nature of the environment and the platform. In certain cases, maybe it'll go down because you have massive supply. So the answer is really depends.
So I think one of the things that I'm hearing all this new language today, and it's a lot confusing, and I'm a measurement guy, I'm a data guy, and I start to hear all these new terms and acronyms, and that's a whole new thing that our industry needs, is more acronyms. But also, kind of figuring out, looking at we have a lot of folks in the room that really kind of focus on the blocking and tackling, or the day-to-day tasks. So, I guess, what's your advice, or what would you tell them that why they have to really focus and keep an eye on addressability to really kind of keep that on their radar screen? I guess what I'm just trying to say is, this seems very high level for some people. I just want to get, from your point of view, why does it have to be on somebody's radar screen, and why is something they have to pay attention to, get involved with the IAB to kind of really kind of work on their addressability strategy moving forward? So Abby, why don't you start off there?
Sure. If you think from the buy side of the market, right, you have, let's say, $1 million to spend on a campaign. If that budget is going to be the same, you're going to start looking at, okay, what is the ROI I'm getting? What is the effectiveness of that $1 million I'm spending on this campaign? All right. So all of a sudden, if you start seeing, all right, I used to get 100 app downloads on the back of the $1 million. Am I still getting that same number or not? And then to see, all right, am I effectively spending that amount? So you will start seeing, I think, a very good incentive for the buy side to get involved is to understand where is the money that I spend on campaigns actually going, and really understanding what is the return, and not just throwing more money because it might be cheaper acquisition costs for the ID-less, for any traffic that's ID-less, because ID-less inventory, it will be less CPM, of course, because there's no way to address this inventory today until we figure out, okay, and for example, use MobX or use on-device audiences, etc., to be able to target and reach these people. So there's a lot of incentive, I would say, for the buy side to become more informed and understanding how can I make my campaign ROIs more effective? And because unless the budgets are going to increase, it's the same budget. How do I make sure that I'm measuring it? Brian, to your point, how to make sure I'm getting the right results? And that will be very important, I think, going forward, especially as you'll start seeing certain fields where the CPMs go up. So all of a sudden, the $1 million isn't going to 2 million. It's still $1 million. How do I spend that $1 million wisely? That'll be very important from the buy side, I would say, to be more actively involved in this. Just understanding how will things play out.
So, Brad, what's the message here? What's the message for the person who is not day-to-day job to be involved in privacy or addressability? Their job is to build content or to buy and plan on a daily basis. Like, how is this going to affect their lives, and why do they need it on their radar screen?
Yeah, I think, at a high level or fundamentally, this is ultimately where certainly we see our industry going over the next, the beginning short term and certainly the long term. And so I think, for anyone that works in this industry, they're going to want to, as best as possible, continue to just stay up to date on the latest trends and direction that this industry that we all work in is ultimately going. Asking questions, attending, events such as this, hopefully retaining some information here as well, and having an open mind when the time presents itself to test and see ultimately how these new methods of buying that are presenting themselves today are going to work for you. I think really that's it at a high level. It's just continuing to keep your ear to the ground, and I think anyone that works in this industry knows how quickly it does move. And so I think to some extent we're probably all at least a little bit used to that by now.
I guess the message that I'm hearing is, don't wait to every deadline. This has to be part of your strategy moving forward, and something you should definitely educate yourself, your consumers on today, because it's going to have a large impact on your business. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and maybe just to quickly add to that as well. I think those that are perhaps earlier adopters throughout all of this may have a bit of an advantage out of the gate too. Just by sort of getting involved in it earlier, and as opposed to waiting, as you mentioned, Brian.
Yeah, and to that, Brad, if you're an early adopter, you're almost in a position to shape some of the. If you get involved, I know if you get
very good point.
To shape how things will actually go on. It's almost like future proofing your department, your job, your 5 to 6 years, what it's going to look like, because the industry in such an interesting space right now. A lot of things are being, we put things back to the drawing board. That's a massive opportunity to actually shape how things will actually happen.
It's a really good point.
Yeah.
So we have 2 minutes here, I'm being told, and I have one. I have several other questions, but I have one that I really want to hit on. So there's a media moniker of reaching the right person with the right message at the right time. Well, addressability seems to kind of change that, because we don't know who the people are. We don't know a lot of sort of information now to connect the dots. So how does addressability change this, almost a 60-year media moniker?
I don't know if it does really, Brian. I think the objective is still the same at the end of the day. And I think the same goes for us as well, sort of, in the unique position that we are somewhat in the middle. We're trying to be as efficient as possible at moving, the dollars from, the marketing budgets to that of the media sellers and the publishers. So despite the fact that maybe the execution looks a little bit differently, I don't know if at the end of the day, the objective really changes much.
Yeah, I'd say I don't think that changes at all. What does change is a couple of things. One is, for example, right now we have our 3 headshots on the screen right now. Brian, Brad, and Abby. These are 3 different consumers. The ability to reach Brad or Abby or Brian as individuals, and I need to know who Brian is. That will change, because that will, let's say it's just a gray box, and I know Brian or some individual is a jogger, is a fitness enthusiast, he enjoys burgers and so on and so forth. That will be there. So then that addressability piece is still there. You can still reach that individual. but you don't need to know who that individual is. So that notion will change of, oh, I need to know that person's entire biodata to be able to target them with the most relevant messaging. That assumption will change significantly. But otherwise, that element of right message, right audience, right moment, that's not going to change, because that's still at the heart of what advertising and personalization is really.
All right, so overall, things are not changing. The whole vision's not changing, but the execution is changing. And I think it's something that we need to educate ourselves and our consumers. And obviously, I think that's a great sort of endpoint and sort of something to leave the crowd with, is like, you got to get involved today and learn about these things. But at the end of the day, the creative, the execution, the rate card, which Brad will be sending after the presentation, will sort of something we all have to kind of work through as an industry. So with that being said, I think we hit our limit here before we get the virtual shutdown or the music playing in the background. I just want to thank both Brad and Abby for their time today and answering some of these questions and sort of educating us. And it seems we have a lot of work to do. So I hope we can take version 2 next year and sort of see where we've come, and if everything you guys have said is true, and if we can come with some better questions next year.
Thanks so much, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks.
Great job.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
well
you.
done.